Good afternoon. My clock says 3 o'clock, so we're at the top of the hour, so we'll go ahead and get started. We want to welcome you today to our webinar, Moving Towards Generate Implementation. Just a few housekeeping things as we get started. We are recording the webinar, and so we've muted all of you when you logged in. But we do want your questions and we do want your feedback, and so you can put any questions and feedback in the chat box. If you select all attendees or all participants, then it should go to everybody, and we'll be taking those questions as we go during the webinar. My name is Tiffany Boyd. I am a TA provider with the Center for Integration of IDA Data, or CIID, and I'm pleased to be joined by our two state panelists today, Sandy and Ann, and I'll let you both introduce yourselves. So, Sandy.
Thanks, Tiffany, and thanks for having me here today. My name is Sandy Grumick, and I am the Part B Data Manager for the state of Washington.
Hi, everybody. I'm Ann Rainey. I'm the Part B Data Manager for the state of Montana.
Super, and we're super excited they're both here today. So our objectives for today's webinar, one of the things this summer when we were at the OSIP Leadership Conference and when we were at Stats DC, we had a number of folks that were asking us, what are some things that we can do to begin preparing for Generate while we're waiting for CIID TA to be available, or if we're wanting to do it on our own, what sorts of things does that involve? And so our objectives for today is to provide some tangible steps and some tangible things that you can do as a state to begin preparing for Generate implementation until TA support is available. And also we want to share some state experiences with Sandy and Ann here related to the preparation for Generate implementation. So those are our objectives for today. On the right side, Travis, if you can open up the poll right now. We're going to open up a poll on the right side. It should pop up on the right side of your screen. It will just be a little poll around just to give us a little bit more about who's on the call. And while that's going on, I just want to briefly go over our agenda. And is that poll up for you all? I'm not seeing it on mine, but do we have that poll up yet?
It is up. Yeah, the poll is up. I see it.
Okay, great. Super. So our agenda for today, first we've got Bill Hennekins here on the line, and he's going to give us just a little bit of an update about the status of CIID and where things are going right now. And then the bulk of our the webinar will be talking through some of the preparation activities that states can do to begin preparing for Generate implementation. And throughout that period, we'll have some, both Sandy and Ann will share some of their experiences as states who have gone through some of this process. We'll also have a number of resources available throughout the slide deck, and we'll talk about some of those at the end as well. And so the poll question is here, what is your state, where are you in relation to the Generate implementation? Are you in the process of implementing? Are you preparing to? Or are you mostly just kind of curious to find out what's involved? And Travis, is that poll still going there?
We just closed it.
It just closed it. Okay, great. We'll have another moment or so. And I wasn't able to see the window, so I'm not sure if I'll be able to see it when it pops up. So if you can read out the results when they're available.
Sure. We have 6 people that are in the process of implementing, 3 that are preparing to implement, and 7 people that are curious.
Super. All right, excellent. And for those of you who are in process, even as Sandy and Ann may be sharing some of their experiences, feel free to provide some of your experiences as well in the chat box. We'd love to have this be a conversation. So, Bill, can you give us just a brief update on the status of CIID?
Yes, thank you, Tiffany, and thank you all for joining. So as you see on the slide, it is hard to believe it's been 5 years, that as of the end of this month, we will be at 5 years with this grant from OSEP for CIID. Boy, it's unbelievable how quickly that went, but nonetheless, here we are. Even though the official grant period for the first 5 years is ending, we do have some resources available, and CIID will be in a no-cost extension through the early December timeframe, so that states that we're working with, we will be able to continue the support that we have been providing. Though it's going to be without some of our partners, or with the partners that have joined AEM in the grant, and each of the states that we're working intensively with, fully been briefed and aware, should be no questions at this point. Though if anyone does have a question, please don't hesitate to let me know. Happy to address any questions at any time. In terms of the future, we continue to be told that there will be another grant opportunity for us to compete for, and we look forward to that. At this point in time, literally just given the timing of when a grant notice coming out, comment period, consideration of those comments, and then the remaining processes, even if something were like released this week, it would not be until after the first of the year that another iteration of CIID or this kind of work would be able to be established. So it'll be some time. There's certainly going to be some kind of gap, though no concern about Generate and the resources that are on our website will all be available. We'll continue to maintain Generate as a comprehensive EdBack solution, but looking there will be some kind of a gap between what we are doing now and a new version of CIID. OSEP certainly willing to address questions around that, and we are as well. So, thank you, Tiffany. Back to you.
Great. Thank you very much. Okay. So we'll jump into the preparation activities, and as we get into this, what we're going to be walking through today are some of the things that we do when we go in and have been working with the state, some of the activities that CIID has done as we kind of prepare to do the implementation. So these are some things that if you are hoping to be working with CIID in the future, there's some things that you can be doing now to kind of speed up the process once we do start working together. And if you're interested in implementing Generate on your own, there's some best practices you may want to consider. So one of the things that we have found is that in order to really sustain an effort, it's really helpful to lay the groundwork first. And so one of the first things that we do with states is we go in and we define the goals and the use cases for implementing Generate. And this is really helpful, and it's really critical to help build support for Generate throughout your agency. Sometimes, maybe one person has kind of caught the vision of Generate and how Generate can support that work, but then it becomes how do you begin to communicate that to other folks and get others on board to be able to support Generate as well. And what we found is that laying out a use case can be a great way of doing this. There's a number of different questions that you can ask yourself as you begin to define the use cases and the goals. And one of the things that we suggest is that you gather a team of folks together to do this, and particularly folks who may have like a strategic viewpoint to help kind of look at that big picture. And so, You may want to ask yourself some of the what and why questions. What is it that you're wanting to, what are some of the reasons that you want to implement, Generate? What do you hope to accomplish? What kinds of problems are you trying to solve or challenges are you trying to address? And then also, what kind of benefits do you anticipate? And beginning to talk through all of that. And then in addition to the what's and the whys, you may also want to start asking about who, and in particular, who might be folks who can help champion this project and help champion the effort to do Generate. In other words, who are some of the folks who have the energy, the enthusiasm, the authority to make some decisions, and the relationships that can help support this goal. So that's another thing to be thinking about. And then also, who might be some of those challengers that might resist the implementation of Generate or who may have concerns about Generate. And it can be really helpful to understand what those concerns are and even talk about, are there ways that we can begin to address those or keep those in mind. One of the things that we've found is that if you're able to address some of the concerns of those folks who may be challengers at the very beginning, they can become a very strong advocate and even a champion as you move forward. So as you have these conversations and these discussions about your use cases and your goals, we encourage you to document those. We have a resource here, the Data Integration Use Case Exercise. But documenting it can be really helpful because then this information can be a touch point that you can go back to throughout the project. It's a way of making sure that everybody's on the same page and that everyone has a common understanding of, what the goals are and what you're hoping to accomplish. But also can be helpful in defining the scope of the project to help define the boundaries and what's part of the project and maybe importantly, too, what's outside of the scope. One of the things that we found as we've worked with states is that oftentimes there may be other preliminary work that comes out as we're going through these use cases and these goals that we do want to include in that scope. In some cases, that may be developing more robust data governance. In other cases, we did some work integrating some of the source data before we got to the point of where we're going to be doing the Generate implementation. So in talking through these use cases and talking through these goals, oftentimes you can identify some of those things. It's also helpful as you're documenting, as you're thinking through this, to think about how Generate might fit into a broader agency initiative and how Generate might be in line with things, some of the strategic direction that your state is already going in, and that's particularly helpful when you're talking with leadership. And then also being able to articulate your goals and it can be helpful as talking points when you're working with stakeholders. So the stakeholders are really key to sustainability over the long term. The more that stakeholders are involved and the more that stakeholders can experience and articulate the benefits of Generate, the easier it will be to get resources and support in the long term that you need to really sustain and maintain Generate. So starting at the very beginning in terms of beginning to identify who those stakeholders are, who are some of the folks that may be impacted by Generate. And these might be some of your data stewards. They may be folks who are using the data. They could be folks who are currently involved in the process of creating and submitting your EdFax files. So starting to think about who are all these key people, internal stakeholders and external stakeholders. And then as you begin to create that list of stakeholders, it can be really helpful too then to make note of what kinds of communication each of those different stakeholders might need. So are these folks who will need detailed information and who need to be involved, really at the detail level? Are they folks who just need like a periodic update from here or there? What might be the ways that we want to communicate with them? And so we have a communication plan template that we often use to capture some of this information and capture how we want to do the communication to make sure that all those key people are in the loop as we move forward. And then gathering the project team. So some of the folks who may be part of defining the use cases and the goals and identifying stakeholders, those may be some of the folks who are on your project team. But also, you want to start to think about what are some of the skill sets that we need, and who are some of the content knowledge area folks that we may need to make this project a success. And some folks may be in for just a portion of that time, some may be in for the entire time, but really kind of thinking through a comprehensive list of folks that would need to be involved in the project at various different points. One of the other things that we'll do as we gather that project team together then is to look at, is there any training that might be needed so that everybody kind of has a base level knowledge. And so sometimes there may be some training needs that you can identify early on. One of the other things that could be helpful to do as you're thinking about the project team is really to think about how the work of doing Generate is going to impact the current workload, and whether the folks that you're bringing in for part of this project team have the capacity to take on those additional responsibilities. And just to make sure that all your whether they have the ability to take on those additional workload, and whether or not you need to shift some responsibilities off their plate. And that could be something you can do even before, like if you know that certain folks may be involved when CIID comes on, and as part of the TA, you can begin to see how can we move responsibilities around in order to free up some time. Once you've identified all your teams, one of the things that we do at the kickoff meeting is go through and identify roles and responsibilities. So we'll go through and think through all the different roles that we can think of as we go through the project, and make sure that we have a name attached with that, or with the different responsibilities, and make sure that we have a name attached with that. Here's a list of different potential team roles that in some of the projects that we've worked on. Generally, we have folks that that fill various of these roles will be part of the project team. Sometimes we have additional folks, additional data stewards coming in. Some folks, as I said, may be in there for the whole part of the project, and sometimes there may be folks who kind of come and go. So at this point, I want to pause for a moment, and I want to bring in our state panelists so that they can share a little bit about what their experience has been like. And so I'm going to start with you, Sandy, and was wondering if you can share a little bit about why Washington decided to implement Generate, and what were some of the goals that you all identified, what you hope to accomplish with Generate, and then secondly, how are you building support for Generate within your agency?
Okay, thanks, Tiffany. So why did Washington want to implement Generate? So the staff who are responsible for data in our division include me, and until somewhat recently, I had 30% of another staff member. In the past 18 months, I've taken on a lot more responsibilities, and I no longer have 30% of another staff member. So I do have assistance from other staff throughout the division for APR reporting, but for preparing files for EdFax reporting in our division, it's just me. So implementing Generate will help streamline the process with less time for me to spend on preparing the data for file submission. What helped me in preparing for implementation, Tiffany talked about this earlier, make sure you have the right players participating. For us, staff from our IT department. Our Chief Information Officer was critical in supporting the work. Our Director of Application Development, he's been with me all the way. We have a supporting database analyst who weighs in as needed. I couldn't have done any of this without the EdFax coordinator and our Director of Data Governance. From the special ed department, the data manager, of course, and then our director or assistant superintendent. Not a lot of time needed from your director, but you have to have their support to move forward. And then another huge task that helped prepare us was aligning our system to the Common Education Data Standards, CIIDs. That was extremely helpful, and the good documentation, especially since we have just recently have staff who are going to be out for long periods of time, or if staff leave the agency, you've got to have that documentation there to support you and to know what's how things were built. At the initial implementation of Generate, I had what I considered a pretty fairly simple goal in mind, and that was to establish a process to create error-free EdFax files. We all want that, including those missing zeros that I know always give me trouble. And I want to be able to do that without having to do a lot of additional transformation of Washington's data. So an example of that goal would be after our child count and our educational environment reporting window closes for our districts, I want EdFax file specs 002 and 089 to be automatically generated and be error-free. In our current process, I have the generation of the files. That's all down, and it's a great process. But I don't have a process where it would account for LEAs who might be missing or have zero counts, and all those cells that that need to be included regardless if there's zero counts or not. Currently, to ensure that I catch those missing zeros, I use those enhanced data check tools that we have available to us, but that takes a few additional steps. So anyways, I thought that would be a fairly simple goal for me to ask for. The most difficult piece for me of moving to Generate was understanding all of the databases behind our statewide student level system. So depending on what file we're trying to create, the data would come out of different databases or kind of holding areas in our system. And at first I tried to complete the ETL mapping by myself, which I didn't even know what ETL meant when we first started this process. So I had a lot of learning to do. I quickly realized I couldn't have mapped that correctly, so I worked with my EdFax coordinator for the mapping. And I don't know what your relationship is with your EdFax coordinator, but mine is amazing, and I couldn't do this without her. The process went more smoothly when we sat down and did the mapping together, and it really does take both you with the special ed background and your EdFax person, because there are nuances of the program side that you need to make sure are mapped correctly as well. Our state has been working with CIID staff, and we're seeing the potential of this tool aside from EdFax files creation and submissions. There are many other reports that we think we can generate out of this system, and we even see some potential for future SPP APR reporting, not through the system, but just to be able to get our data out of there more easily. All of the documenting can be very time-consuming up front, but as you continue to add different data collections, it goes by more quickly, and the documentation, like I said earlier, that work for your state system to CIIDs makes for great project management and less work and time consumption in the future. About building support within the agency, as I was initially approached about the project, I thought it would just be me doing the work. I didn't have the big picture knowledge of what it would entail, but you do need a much broader group. So as I said earlier, our Chief Information Officer has been supporting this project from the very beginning. Our director, we have had a new director to implement this project, so having her support has been great. And they both heard about this at their national conferences, so they were aware of using the potential that they might see in using Generate before I even approached them. And our CIO actually took the lead in reaching out to the special ed department to pursue the implementation of Generate. So if you're interested in pursuing, talk to your CIO and have them reach out to other states who are implementing Generate. As we began to implement the project in our state, other staff on that initial team started to see how we could use Generate beyond just IDEA reporting. Our Director of Data Governance has been a part of the process from the very beginning, and she sees the potential in Generate and hopes to expand to other EdFacts reports outside of IDEA, since there are so many connections and our students are subgroups of the larger file submissions, especially the assessment. That's the first example that comes to my mind. We have also mapped our directory data, that file spec 029, since that is so critical to every other EdFacts submission that we do. And our Director of Data Governance also gives regular updates about Generate to different data management and business owner groups in our agency, as well as at our cabinet and directors meetings within the agency. So we hope to keep this momentum moving forward. And again, our Chief Information Officer and Director of Application, they have participated from the initial implementation of the project, and they also carry the message throughout the agency about other potential uses of the tool.
Super. Thank you, Sandy. Yeah, appreciate you sharing all of that. Anne, I'm wondering if you can share a little bit in terms of why in Montana that you all chose to implement Generate and what sorts of things you hope to accomplish, and also how you're building support for Generate within the agency.
So Generate came out at a really opportune time for Montana. We had staff here in the office that for a number of years had been trying to figure out how best to streamline our data reporting. We have an EdFacts coordinator, but it's not a full-time dedicated position. She kind of does it on top of, other things. And so there were times where she was just being bombarded with people saying they needed files run, they needed things generated, they needed files submitted, and there were occasions where we never missed deadlines, but just things got a little backed up in the queue. And so we were trying to figure out how to streamline it, not really going to high-level decision makers at the office until we had a plan together. And then we had a new superintendent that was elected in November of 16, and when she took office in January of 17, she decided that was going to be the first big thing that she tackled, was getting our data reporting streamlined. And so I kind of started having some conversations with Bill and with Anna and with folks here, and then our chief of our bureau that does all of the data reporting outside of special education had some conversations. She and our CCD coordinator and our EdFacts coordinator had some conversations with Bill and Anna at staff that summer, and we were able to bring them in and have them talk to us about what the potential is for having Generate in Montana and what that means. And we've had some shift in duties here. They finally saw the light and brought our EdFacts coordinator over and put her in the data unit, which just makes a whole lot more sense than having her stuck in our IT department, where she's far removed from anyone working on data. We've had some shifts in the upper level management that we've had to continue to go back to them and garner support again. But there's a good working crew. The EdFacts coordinator is huge and hugely supportive of this and sees the potential for where it can go beyond IDEA. The CCD coordinator has been a huge supporter and proponent of this since it came to Montana. The bureau chief for our data bureau she's been our project manager and champion from the very beginning with this, and I couldn't have gotten us anywhere that we are without her. And just having that kind of core team of us that saw the light at the end of the tunnel with this and have been able to be the cheerleaders for it in the state has been amazing. And then we actually were able to bring it in with our SLEDS grant, our SLDS grant, and it's a huge component of the new grant application that we just wrote to be able to streamline all of our data reporting outside, including IDEA, but everything, and have that one place that we can generate all of these files and that one place that we can kind of hold all of the data and tie that into our statewide longitudinal data system. That's going to be a huge change for us, and we're really excited about the opportunities that it's presenting moving down the road. So I don't know, I feel like I kind of went off on a tangent, but that's kind of where we're at with it. So.
Super. I appreciate that. I appreciate just even talking about how you're now weaving that into some of your other agency initiatives, so like your SLDS grant program, and then with both of you talking too about some of the folks who were the specific folks who were part of the champions and folks who helped move the project along. So I appreciate your sharing on that. And for those who are participating in the webinar, if you have questions for either Sandy or Ann, please feel free to type them into the chat box. So in the first part where I was talking, we talked a little bit about laying the project management foundation, and so now we want to talk a little bit about some of the ways that when we go in and do our TA, where we begin to focus on understanding and preparing the technical landscape. And Sandy touched on some of these things, so we'll go into them into a little bit more detail. So one of the first things that we want to do is to assess the current environment, and to see, like, yes, what strengths that we have in our current environment, where are some of the places that we can improve. And one of the ways that we do that is through the use of the CIID self-assessment tool. So it's a Part B data framework self-assessment tool. It's a companion to the IDC Part B data system framework. And if you've never used that framework, the way that it's organized is there are some components of data quality, things like data governance, data use, data integration, purpose and vision, stakeholder engagement, things like that. Within each component, there are some quality indicators, and then each of those indicators is broken down into an element of data quality. And so what this self-assessment does is you go in and you look at those elements of data quality, and you begin to say, okay, is this something that we're doing in our agency right now? If we are, let's write some evidence. There's a place there to capture some evidence in terms of this is how we're implementing that. And then you can do some rating in terms of, what level of implementation is there? Is this something that we're fully implementing? We're only partially, something we're in the planning stages, or actually this is something that we don't even, it's not really even on our radar, and we don't even have any plans for it. And then there's also a place where you can then begin to add a priority. So is this a high priority for us, or a low priority, medium priority? And so when we go in with CIID, we use that information. Each of the states will work on that, and often with a team of folks, again, to get broad perspectives. And then we use that to help as we prioritize the work and help determine, what kinds of things that we want to include in that activity. So that's one of the things that you could be doing as well. Sandy mentioned documentation and a number of different pieces of documentation, and it's really helpful to begin to gather that documentation. Or I know from my years of working in the state that sometimes not all of our systems were really all that well documented. So sometimes it may be even taking some time to create some documentation. In particular, the kinds of things that we will be using as we go in there are the data dictionary. And so this is your data dictionary for all of your source systems, all of those systems that are going to feed into Generate. The data elements, their definitions, what formats they're in, any relationships that are important between those fields, capturing a lot of that information. I noticed that earlier Bill had put something in the chat box about CEDS, the Common Education Data Standards. That can be a great starting point if you don't have data definitions. It can be a great place to start. You'll also want to gather any business rule documentation that you have for creating those EdFax files. So, what kinds of transformations are taking place, what filters are you using, what kinds of conditions might be met, and gathering that information up. And then if you have any process documentation, if you've done any work with IDC on their data process protocols, or if you have other process documentation that kind of walks through what are the steps that we do in order to get our files ready, and who does those steps in what order, that can be really helpful as we get in, as we get into our processes. One of the things that you can also, as you're gathering that process documentation, is start to think through, are there places where we have bottlenecks or challenges in our current processes, and what kinds of things might be getting squeezed out due to time constraints. Both Sandy and Ann talked about really wanting to streamline that process. So where are the places where you're getting bottlenecked up? So capturing a lot of that information. And why are we gathering all that information? Well, we gather a lot of that. A lot of it is really to support the ETL development. One of the things that we'll do with those data dictionaries, and again, Sandy had mentioned this, was that we'll take your data source system, we'll align it to the Common Education Data Standards, which is what Generate is built on. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in the future, or in just a couple more slides. So that's why we want the data dictionaries. And then the business rule documentation, the process documentation, a lot of that can be really helpful when developing the ETL, and it also can be really helpful when you may be troubleshooting. So once you get some ETL in there and you're trying to see if we can match the numbers from your legacy system, sometimes that process documentation or those business rules can be a help in terms of troubleshooting. One of the other things that Sandy mentioned earlier was getting a sense of where all your data is coming from. And so one of the things that we tend to do at our kickoff meetings is we create a map, a visual diagram of how the data flows from your source systems in all the places that it goes before it becomes an EdFax submission file. And we'll create a visual diagram for that. And as TA providers, that's really helpful for us to begin to understand your environment, but it also can be really helpful for folks in the state to get that big picture view of all the different pieces. I know a director in one of the states I worked with had said, I knew we had a lot of data, I knew we had a lot of hands touching that data, but I really had no idea how many systems and how many people were involved. So it's a really great way of being able to get that big picture view. And here's just a couple of examples of how that can look like. I mean, it can be just put some big giant Post-it notes up on the wall, and you can draw it with your marker and pen, or if you want to do something in Visio, the technology really doesn't matter. It's just more of capturing some of that information and doing that with a group of people and having conversations to create some of that common understanding. So we mentioned aligning the data sources to CEDS maps, to the CEDS data model. And so we do that using the CEDS Align tool. This becomes really helpful because the Generate team has created a number of CEDS connections for each of the different EdFax files. And each connection there will include a list of all the CEDS data elements that are needed to create that file. And once your data dictionary has been aligned to CEDS, you can then use this tool called MyConnect to create a bridge. And you can begin to see how the source system and how that maps to Generate. And that becomes some of the basis for our ETL. So that was some of the mapping that Sandy had talked about. Now, this is a place that CIID has typically provided a lot of support. And we have also had some states who have chosen to do this on their own, so it is possible either way. For those of you who may be interested in doing that and have not yet begun mapping, there is some technical or some assistance that can be available through the CEDS team, so you could even contact them through the contact form at the CEDS website, which is listed here. And all of these will be in the All of these links will be in the presentation slides, so you can just link to it from here. So now I want to go back to our panelists and just to hear a little bit more. I know, Sandy, that you touched on some of this earlier, but I don't know if there's anything else that you want to share about things that you learned as you kind of assess your environment or some of the other preparation activities that you found to be most impactful.
Sure. So what I learned a lot was about our internal processes of our statewide student level system and how that data populate into downstream applications. I may not have the tech lingo down, but I do understand our developers a lot better than I did before. During the ETL documentation, our team was able to review and determine if we were making the most efficient connections out of our internal systems. And so we were able to assess any weaknesses in that system. So that was really, really good to see. The activities that I found most impactful, again, were the self-assessment tools and documenting our processes. We did this after we were done with our ETL checklist and making the documentation of our data processes. It made the documentation of those data processes much easier, and we were able to complete them much more quickly than we would have if we hadn't done the checklist and the SEDS alignment. The staff from the project worked with me and my EdFax coordinator using the data processes toolkit, and they guided us through the toolkit, and we were able to create data processes and documentations for some of our higher level, IDEA reporting, the child count and ed environments process, our directory, the exiting process, and discipline. And yeah, each of these sessions took about an hour to an hour and a half, but they now live on a SharePoint site that I created for data and reporting, and all of our documentation and supporting documents and TA sources are linked or saved on that site. So it definitely takes an entire team from many different areas in your agency, but it also distributes the ownership of the system. So, we feel like we're breaking down data silos by going through this process. And I believe it really helps strengthen relationships with not just the special ed department, but all the other departments throughout the agency that touch this data. And it really can have a positive impact on your overall data governance processes.
Super. Thank you for sharing that. And then, Anne, what were some of the things that you learned as you assessed your current environment, and which of the activities that we've been talking about, or other ones that maybe I haven't mentioned, did you find most impactful thus far in your work?
So I kind of have to echo what Sandy said about breaking down silos. This process has really forced us all to take a really hard look at what are we doing that's duplicating effort across divisions and units in our agency. How can we streamline that? How can we get it down so that I'm not looking at the same thing, the same data elements on a set of kids that our CCD coordinator is looking at for that same set of kids as we're getting ready to do our membership files. You know, when we're all working with that same group of kids, why are we duplicating the effort? So we've cut back on some of that. We've really streamlined how we're working on pieces of that. It's been interesting to learn how our systems play together. We have a statewide student information system that's a very transactional system, and within its database, we house the table structures for all of our other data collections. And so it's been really interesting to try to figure out how all of that plays together and how we make sure that we're looking at the right data when we're getting ready to pull our EdFacts files, and really looking at it as a team, like Sandy said, sitting with those IT folks, sitting with her, with the other players in the agency, and being able to just have a better understanding of what other people's job is as it relates to how you get your data submitted to the feds and how you get that data from the district. It really has created a very collaborative team here. Getting to work with folks in the agency that otherwise I wouldn't have an opportunity to work with, and really I should. So it's been really nice for building those relationships and breaking down those silos.
Super. Thank you so much for sharing that. I really appreciate hearing from both of you in terms of how that, just how that work just even impacted the relationships that you all have within the agency. So at this point, we want to talk about just some additional resources that are available. And so throughout the slide so far, you've seen a number of different resources on each of the different pages, and a number of those come from this CIID Data Integration Toolkit. The toolkit is something that we've created that actually helps us organize our work, and it's broken up into 7 steps, and each of those steps are broken up into some tasks and activities, and there's often resources. So some of the resources that we saw throughout the presentation thus far have been linked in this data integration toolkit. So that's a great one-stop place to go to get a lot of these resources. For those who are just wanting to just get a lot more of the technical information, the user guides, FAQs, implementation resources, and things like that around Generate, you can go to, there's a Generate page on our website. And then, as we've referred to a couple different times, there's the Common Education Data Standards. And a lot of the tools that we've talked about, there's a lot of information about those tools on the CEDS website. So in addition to those kinds of things, there are a couple different user groups that you may be interested in. And so, Bill, I was wondering if you can just talk a little bit about the Generate Governance Group and what that is and how that works.
Yeah, sure, Tiffany. Thanks for the opportunity. So Generate Governance Group is really a collection of folks from states that to help guide us in the development, the evolution of Generate as an application that sits upon the Common Education Data Standards. It's really an avenue for states to provide feedback, input, their priorities for what we collectively as a community do with Generate as a application to automate, simplify EdFacts reporting, to do all of the things that Sandy and Ann have talked about today in terms of a solution to help them do their work. So how to join, the information is linked there, and thanks.
Great, thank you. And then, Tricia, I was wondering if you can talk just a little bit about the CEDS open source community.
Sure, thank you, Tiffany. So the CEDS is establishing an open source community. It is a collaborative effort that is going to allow community members to build and modify code, suggest improvements, and share solutions. Stakeholders will be working side by side with the CEDS team to build out CEDS for all of their needs. So instead of having to wait for new versions to be released on an annual basis, stakeholders will now be able to make suggestions and improvements to CEDS as they come up. So the community will truly be driving the future of CEDS, which is really exciting. The open source community will have a collection of repositories in GitHub that will be used for stakeholder contribution. So as needs arise, or adjustments or expansions to the model, stakeholders can provide a use case to be considered by the community for community review. And if it's accepted, it will be implemented as an update to the CEDS standard. And then in kind of correlation with that, in addition to GitHub, we're going to be utilizing the CEDS communities of practice, which the COPs, which are basically spots for stakeholders to engage in conversations and discussions and access documentation and notifications. So there's the using CEDS COP, and then there's the new one that has recently been added for the open source community, which is a community of stakeholders that are developing CEDS resources. We are still establishing a governance process and a submission protocol for these use cases, but that should be released here pretty quickly. And that's all for me, Tiffany.
Great. And part of why we wanted Trish to share a little bit about this open source community is because CEDS is that foundation that Generate's built on. So even as CEDS becomes more robust and expands into different areas based on community desires and needs, then that also can increase the foundation that Generate's built on. So appreciate you sharing a little bit about that. Also wanted to just on the CEDS or on the CID website, even during the gap that Bill had talked about, all these resources and things like that, there's a number of other publications, some of the webinars that we've done, some resources even from the State Longitudinal Data System State Support Team and other kinds of resources have all been gathered there. So there's lots of different other tools and resources that are also available on the CID website. So at this point, we want to open it up for some questions, wondering if any of you have questions, I'm imagining particularly for Sandy or for Anne, about their experiences or just other questions you might have about what it was like for them as they've gone through some of these preparation steps and as they're doing the implementation right now. So we have some time for that. You can just type your questions there into the chat box. And then, Travis, I was also wondering, we do have an evaluation survey that we will open up as at the end of the end of the webinar, but I'm also wondering if you can put that link in the chat box as well, just so that folks have that. We appreciate any feedback about the webinars, knowing what's helpful, what kinds of information is of interest to you, so anything that you can do on that survey, or filling out that survey, it would be really helpful for us. So yeah, are there any, let's see, questions here? So I see one question, how long did it take each of the panelists to complete their CEDS mapping all the way to using Generate? So I don't know if you can talk a little bit in terms of some of the time frames of from like when you did the CEDS mapping to maybe when you submitted a file. One of the things that we tend to do, and I'll speak to this before we get to the, and then we'll let the panelists speak, because oftentimes we might be working with one data set at a time, so we might do the CEDS mapping for one of the data sets and then work through the whole process on that. and then begin some of the other data sets as we move along. But Sandy or Ann, do you want to just talk a little bit in terms of what the time frame was for you?
Yeah, I can start if you like. So I did my example, the only data that we've submitted so far is for our child count and ed environments file specs. And so me and the EdFacts coordinator sat down and did the SEDS align mapping, and that in itself probably took, that was our first one, so it took us a bit to get started. So it probably took us an hour and a half to 2 hours to complete that mapping of each element and making sure that we had that right and the elements in our system right. And then it was actually CIID staff who took some of our files and our data and process them through Generate. And we did go back and forth with a couple of phone calls to find out why we were like 5 kids different, and it was an internal process here in Washington State that we were able to figure out what happened with those 5 kids. It came down to like a unique identifier being used for 2 different kids, but the system Generate helped us find that where we would not have found that internally within our state. So it took a couple of weeks of just working back and forth, but nobody's working on this full time, so it really didn't eat up a lot of time that I'm aware of.
Great, thanks for sharing that. And Ann, how about for you in Montana?
So I didn't actually do the SEDS alignment. Our CCD coordinator did that with Roberta from CIID. And then we had Andrea Hall came in and sat with us for a couple of days from the SEDS Center and worked with us on stuff. And I got to be a part of that, but I wasn't really the one doing the mapping. That being said, our timeline is a little off due to some internal changes that happened as we were getting ready to submit our first file. So we've actually got our IDEA SEDS alignment has been done for 6 months or so, I think, almost a year maybe, and we have not submitted a file. Again, that's not because of anything to do with Generate. It's some internal stuff that happened here, but there's not a lot of time between when you finish that SEDS alignment and when you can submit that file. It's a pretty quick turnaround.
And just to clarify, too, that CEDS alignment is something that you do sort of one time, and it helps in developing the ETL code. And then once that ETL code is, written and tested and validated, then when you come back around the next year, it goes pretty quickly. And that's one of the things that we have found. I lost my train of thought of what else I was going to say. So are there other questions that are in here? Let's see. So can we talk about the EdFi ODS generation integration tool, compatibility, implementation, and considerations? Tricia or Bill, do one of you want to touch base a little bit about EdFi and how the EdFi ODS Generate work together?
Yeah, I can jump in on that. We have an active project with the folks at EdFi with support from the foundation, Michael Dell Foundation, to build a connector between the EdFi ODS and Generate. And that work is being piloted in Nebraska and well underway. And really it kind of goes to the theme of our work, no matter kind of where a state is at, we want to meet them in that work and facilitate the use of CEDS, the use of Generate to meet the needs of the state. And so several states wanted us to do that with with the Ed5 folks, and so we've worked to make that happen. And so, you know, kind of a lot of details to it that we can jump into, but at a high level, it's an automated way to move data from the Ed5 operational data store into CEDS and Generate. And, you know, happy to jump into details with someone later offline.
Great. Thanks very much. And I remembered what I was going to say in response to what one of the things Ann said. One of the things that we'll do with the CIID TAs, oftentimes that first time around, what we're trying to do is match the numbers through the Generate process of what folks are getting through their legacy processes, and may not necessarily submit the data the first time around, so just wanted to clarify on that. We're just about at the top of the hour, so we've got some contact information here. Again, this will all be on when this is posted on the website, so if you have questions for anyone here, you can feel free to reach out for some more information. And then, as we mentioned, if you can take a moment to do the survey. And I want to thank both Sandy and Ann so much for sharing a little bit about the experiences in your state, and I think that's really valuable for all of us to be able to hear. So thank you all, and I think that's it for today.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Yeah, thank you for including me.
Great.
Thank you, everyone.